Amandla. Amandla. Phambili ngomzabalazo wabakhosikazi phambili. Malibongwe. Malibongwe. Thank you. I have seen the posters, and let us sit down. We will talk about them as well. Minister, Program Director, Minister in the Presidency for Women, Minister Batabile Dlamini, Minister of Arts and Culture, Minister Natim Tetwa, ministers and deputy ministers present here today, premiers of our provinces in the Free State and the Northern Cape, the Speaker of our National Assembly, Ms. Anne Kituku Shongwe, UN Women, based here in SADC, Ms. Asetu Koite, the President of the Pan-African Women's Organization, MEC Mare of the Western Cape Province, Mayor of the Winelands District, Dr. Elna von Schildt, Mayor of the Drakensberg Municipality, Mr. Conrad Poole, the Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General of the governing party, the African National Congress, leaders of women, civil society organizations, the ANC Women's League, the Ilita Labantu, Charlotte Maxeke Institute, Thulasizwe Manye, faith-based organizations, the stalwarts of our liberation movement, Umamu Sophie de Bruyn, Mme Mildred Lesia, Miss South Africa, fellow South Africans, I welcome you and I'm pleased to be here. Minister Batabile Dlamini, you spoke about how Umama Sisulu encouraged women to have their afros. I used to wear an afro as well. I had the most beautiful afro in my younger days. And I'm actually thinking that I should let my hair grow so that my afro can come back. We are celebrating Women's Day in a historic year. Historic because in this year we remember a number of people who have played a critical role in our struggle. It is historic on this year because 100 years ago, a great leader of our struggle, Mamu Charlotte Maxeke, led women across the country to form the Bantu Women's League. Charlotte Maxeke was born at a time when women were still considered auxiliary members of the National Liberation Movement. The Bantu Women's League defied not only the tyranny of racial oppression, but also the prejudice and discrimination that women continued to confront on a daily basis during her time. It advanced, that is the Bantu Women's League, advanced a vision of a society defined by freedom, dignity, equality, and respect. The struggles fought by the Bantu Women's League affirmed black women as political activists and social reformers, as well as leaders in their own right and agents of their own liberation. That was 100 years ago. This year we also celebrate the centenary of the birth of Umama Albertina Sisulu, one of the greatest leaders this country has known, a woman who inherited the fighting spirit of Charlotte Maxeke and the institutional legacy of the Bantu Women's League. We celebrate her extraordinary contribution to the struggle of the people of our country for liberation. Through Umama Albertina Sisulu, through her courage and selflessness, she kept the flames of freedom burning even in the darkest hours and moments of apartheid oppression. She suffered greatly and was separated from her husband, Walter Sisulu, for many, many years. She was left as a single mother, having to care for the children of the Sisulu family. She embodied the values that continue to guide our struggle for the emancipation of women and indeed the freedom of all people all over. Women's Day is an opportunity to pay tribute to the remarkable women leaders who have been at the forefront of the liberation struggle. And it is in this regard that we as a nation should regard ourselves as being fortunate to have had iconic women who have not only participated in our struggle, but who have also led the struggle, but also during difficult and dangerous times. It is on this day that we remember leaders like Umama Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Rahima Musa, Sophie de Bruyn, Dora Tamana, Betha Gowa, Florence Matumela, Ruth First, Dorothy Zihlangu, Ray Alexandra, Liz Abrams, Dorothy Nyembe, Victoria Mklenge, Pila Ndwandwe, Nomkosi Mini, Colleen Williams, Fatima Mier, Florence Ribeiro, Mama Shinini, Sister Bernard Ngube, Lydia Kompe, Dalcy September, Josephine Mashobane, Mildred Lycia, Helen Suzman, and many others. We pay tribute to these women and many others who went to prison for burning their passes, who stood trial for treason, who defied unjust laws, who went on strike for a living wage, who joined the ranks of Umkhonto Wesizwe, and we have many of them here today, who were banished, who were forced into exile, who were censured, who were jailed, who lost their lives to the murderous forces of the apartheid state. And today, we celebrate those women and we applaud them and we dip our heads and say, thank you for what you did for our struggle. Andiyiva kahle le applause. Ek hoor nie hierdie applause baie lekker nie. So Women's Day is a celebration of the achievements of all these women and millions more, because the women of our country have carried and have borne the brunt of the oppression that was unleashed on our people in a way that is indescribable and unbelievable. It is also a celebration of the great achievements over many years of struggle to ensure that the role of women in society and in public life is recognized and affirmed. It is also a celebration of the many women who have excelled in fields from which they have traditionally been excluded, who today occupy positions of authority and responsibility. It is a celebration of the great strides being made by young women in the fields of medicine, science, arts, entrepreneurship, politics, farming, the academia, and many, many other areas. It is a celebration of our Constitution, the transformational laws that we have passed, and our ongoing efforts to ensure that women are equally able to occupy positions of responsibility and authority in all spheres of life. It is a celebration of the road we have traveled since the Bantu Women's League was formed a century ago. Fellow South Africans, on this Women's Day, as we celebrate our achievements, we are bound to recognize that the struggle for the emancipation of women of this land, South Africa, has to continue. Our efforts to build a society that is defined by freedom, dignity, equality, and respect is incomplete. Poverty, hunger, homelessness, landlessness, and unemployment define the lives of millions of our people. Prejudice, discrimination, exploitation, and violence are still present in our society, which, despite the progress that we have made, has not yet fully emerged from our racist and patriarchal past. Many South African women are still burdened by poverty and oppressed by cultural practices, social convention, and prejudice. The face of poverty and suffering in our country is still worn by the women of South Africa. Many are not able to have access to educational and economic opportunities. They are neglected in the provision of government services and are overlooked by the business community. Patriarchy remains a defining feature of our society. We men must get it into our heads that we do not own women, nor do we own their bodies, and that we should never seek to dominate them. In our constitutional dispensation, no human being has the right to dominate another, meaning that patriarchy, which manifests itself through men seeking to dominate women in our country, has to come to an end, because we do not own the women in our country. This Women's Day as we celebrate our achievements, as we recognize our many challenges, let us reaffirm our determination together as women and as men to build a truly non-sexist South Africa. We must intensify and hasten our efforts to advance women's emancipation and achieve meaningful gender equality. We must, however, start with a grave admission, an admission that I believe men in our country have to make. Across our society, in towns, small and large cities, in homes, in schools, in colleges and universities, in our streets, our parks and open spaces, a war is being waged against the women of South Africa. It is a war against women's bodies, their dignity, their right to freedom, their right to security and equality. It is an affront to our common humanity and a betrayal to the values of our Constitution. In ways that are both subtle and brutal, women are subjected each and every day to verbal as well as emotional and physical abuse. In a society that has long struggled against gender-based violence, the assault on the integrity and humanity of women has reached unprecedented levels. While it is difficult to establish the full extent of this epidemic, as many offenses go unreported, studies show that the lifetime experience of South African women of gender-based violence is higher than the global average. Disturbingly, a significant percentage of South African men admit to perpetrating violence against women. Women are abused by virtue of the fact that they are women, that some of them are also transgender, and some of them are gender non-conforming, or because of their sexual orientation. Violence is also perpetrated against women by men who are strangers, others are acquaintances, others are relatives, and yet others are even intimate partners. The violence that women are subjected to crosses boundaries of race and class and culture and language. Yet there is a real danger that because violence against women has become so pervasive, society is gradually becoming unmoved and has stopped seeing it as an unacceptable and abhorrent practice. Instead of being outraged and angry, there is a weary acceptance that this is the norm. Instead of action, there is only lamentation. In answering the threat of complacency last week, thousands of women mounted huge protests across the country as part of campaigns by the #TotalShutdown movement and the Young Women's Desk of the ANC Women's League. I can report, Auntie Sophie de Bruyn, that a large group of women marched to the union buildings, demanding, as you did 62 years ago, that the government addresses the plight of South Africa's women. Unlike you, Auntie Sophie, these protesters were met by a government of the people, a government democratically elected with a clear, unequivocal mandate to transform society. You were correct in saying I was called to go and meet these young women. I had been busy the whole day elsewhere, and they said with a very clear voice that they would not leave the union buildings until the president came to address them and receive their memorandum. I acceded, even though it was late in the day, in the night in fact, and went to receive their memorandum. Unlike in your case, Auntie Sophie, these protesters were met by a government that listens and that is determined to work with all South Africans to rid our country of this scourge. I stood there and listened, and I listened, I must say, to some of the most harrowing stories of young women who had been violated in a number of ways. Some had been raped up to 3 times. Some related how their own teenage girls had been raped and how they had continued to be brutalized in ways that are undescribable. As a man standing there, I was deeply humbled, but I was also deeply hurt. We are a government that says that there is no place for people who want to victimize those who report violence against women and who protest against it. I encouraged these young women to keep raising their voices against violence against women, against rape, and against the deaths that are being perpetrated against women. We are committed to deal with any amongst us who want to continue perpetrating gender-based violence against women. We are committed to also deal with police officers who, through their treatment of survivors of violence, make the trauma and the pain even worse. We salute all those who took part in these protests, who had the courage to raise their voices, to articulate their anger, their frustration, their hurt, their pain, their humiliation, their disappointment of so many South African women. We salute them for challenging those of us in positions of authority to act with greater purpose and urgency to end the war that is being fought and waged against the women of our country. We must acknowledge, as a government and as a society, that since the advent of democracy, we have failed to ensure that the women of South Africa are able to exercise their constitutional right to peace and security. In that sense, we have failed to live up to the promise of 1994. We therefore share the responsibility to correct this failing, to work together across society to fundamentally change attitudes, to fundamentally change practices and institutions to end the abuse of women and violence against women. The women of our country, in their memorandum that they submitted to me at the union buildings and other memoranda that were submitted in other places, have suggested, they've even demanded, they've even called for the holding of a national gender summit where they want to discuss matters of national importance about how our country can give them the best life that they deserve. I'm here today to say on Women's Day that the government has agreed that this National Gender Summit should take place on the 31st of August to forge consensus on appropriate approaches that should be taken on an urgent basis to deal with the crisis of gender-based violence, discrimination against women, and gender disparities. The recommendations of the National Gender Summit must be comprehensive. They must guide the work of government and the activities of all stakeholders. Government is therefore committed to doing its part through policies, through its budgetary processes, through its programs and practices that will dramatically reduce levels of gender-based violence and ultimately eradicate it. To ensure that also swift action is taken against perpetrators and which provide necessary support and protection to survivors of violence. When the young women marched to the Union buildings, there were 2 police officers. One of them slapped one of the women who were marching, and one of them insulted some of the women. And I have directed the Minister of Police to immediately investigate this matter and make sure that we take action against those police officers with immediate effect. Ultimately, however, violence against women is a societal issue. It requires that all of us, wherever we are, should become actively engaged in ending this brutal assault on our people and our society. It should also focus on how, as Minister Mteto was saying, we bring up the boy child, and how, as a society and as parents, we raise the level of consciousness, yes, amongst men. And I'm delighted that some of the programs that the ANC Women's League is going to be embarking on, and indeed many other women organizations are going to be embarking on, is to have dialogue with the men in our country. As a nation, we do need to pay attention to the level of consciousness of men and get behind what makes them behave in this way, where they not only rape but also kill the women of our country. The women of South Africa deserve to be treated with respect. They deserve to be protected. They deserve to be honored, because they are, in the end, the mothers of our nation, and they bring life into this world. But more importantly, women are the majority population group in our country, and therefore we must treat them properly. If we are to realize the vision of the pioneering women who founded the Bantu Women's League, we must also improve the economic position of women. That is why we have placed the creation of jobs and training opportunities for young people, and especially young women, at the center of our economic agenda. We must recognize that young women are doing much themselves, taking advantage of educational opportunities, starting businesses, bringing energy and innovation to a number of fields and occupations. It is a matter of great pride today as we see young women acceding to higher levels of education. As a country, we are particularly proud to see that many girl children are now filling the classrooms of our schools. They are filling the lecture rooms of our universities. This is an important level of advancement that we want to see getting better and better all the time. Yet, despite the progress made, young people are more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the population. Young women face additional challenges of gender inequality, discrimination, and oppressive social practices. Therefore, each and every policy and program that advances the empowerment of young people must make specific provision for the empowerment of young women. An important part of our effort will be to create pathways for young women into work. Many young black women do not have the skills, access to networks, or exposure to the work environment to easily find employment. Many live far away from potential places of work and cannot afford to go looking for work. So they stay at home, and largely also because they don't even have the money to pay for transport. In response to this challenge, government, business, labor, and several civil society organizations have worked together to launch the Youth Employment Service, which facilitates one-year work experience opportunities for unemployed young people in participating companies. We will be closely monitoring the intake into this program, as well as the outcomes, to ensure that young women are equally represented, if not more represented. Ultimately, the most direct and sustainable way to empower young women is through education and skills development. And this is where we say the place of young women is in the classroom, is in the lecture hall. That is where we want to find the majority of them. Global experience has shown that education is the most effective way to empower young women and promote gender equality. Yet young women face several challenges, such as outdated attitudes to the education of women, relegation to domestic duties, or responsibility for childcare. And this is where we must say, young women must be in the professions. Young women must be running companies. Young women must be running universities. They must be the engineers of our nation. They must be the doctors of our nation. They must be the key professionals. And I would like to see South Africa making sure that many young women in our country get the best education opportunities they can and get into the professions so that they can be in a better position to lead our nation. Our nation is hungry for the leadership, yes, of women, and we must move in that direction. So say I. That is why we need to ensure that girls and young women, yes, remain in school to complete matric. We often find that many young women only go up to 10 years of school, and along the way they stumble and fall and don't finish their matric. And we are saying to parents, even if the young women in our nation stumble and fall, due to a whole range of reasons. Let us make sure that we help them to stand up. Let them pick themselves up, and let's help pick them up so that at the very least they finish 12 years of schooling. We want them to be in areas like mathematics and science, technology, and that they should proceed without hindrance to higher levels of education as well. Our government has embarked on a range of measures to accelerate comprehensive land reform and to expand agricultural production. These measures, in addition to creating and correcting a historical injustice, are aimed to unlock the economic potential of our land and our people. It is essential that we use this process of land reform as we make sure that the land of our country is restored to the people of our country. Let us ensure that there is equitable access for women to the land in both the rural and urban areas. The land should not only be parceled out to men. We must focus, and we will make sure that we do in government. We want the land reform process to be a mechanism through which we economically empower the women of our country for agriculture, for housing, as well as for enabling them to get into business processes. Women who live in rural areas must have their right to land recognized and enforced, and must have the means to use their land to improve their lives and the lives of their families. Poor and working class women have the same right and need to have the same opportunity as men to own property in well-located areas, whether it is in the rural areas or the urban areas. As we embark on the distribution of title deeds to our people, we are committed to ensure that women are, at minimum, equal beneficiaries of government programs to address asset poverty. The return of the land will have little meaning and limited effect unless it is returned to all those from whom it was taken, both men and women as well. Importantly, we must lead a campaign to change patriarchal attitudes in society. It is vital that everyone understands that where women are emancipated, society tends to progress, and society advances forward, and society does indeed thrive. We must empower young men to play their role in freeing society from the oppressive bonds of patriarchy. When women are free, we are all going to be free. For as long as women are not free, we are all not free. We look to young women to lead the charge in this regard. They should not wait for others to liberate them. Like those who marched on the Union buildings last week, and like those who marched on the Union buildings in 1956, they should realize that the power to achieve meaningful change is in their hands. It is 100 years since the formation of the Bantu Women's League, and 100 years since the birth of that great stalwart of our movement, Umama Albertina Sisulu, We mark these historic events not merely to recall the extraordinary path that women of our country have walked over many decades of oppression, repression, discrimination, and exploitation. We really and essentially mark these events not only to applaud the outstanding contributions that millions of women have made to the achievement of our non-racial and non-sexist democracy. We mark these events so that we may be reminded, as we look to the future, that no matter how great the challenges we face, no matter how difficult the problems that we must overcome, by working together, men and women, young and old, black and white, we can succeed, and indeed we can prevail. Guided by the revolutionary vision of Umama Charlotte Maxeke, inspired by the unrelenting courage and commitment of Umama Albertina Nontsikelelo Sisulu, and fortified by the daily struggles of millions of South African women, we will surely succeed to build a society in which the daughters of our nation will be able to live in peace, will be able to live in dignity, will be able to have security and comfort, but more importantly, will feel protected as they walk the streets of our townships, will feel secure as they roam about in the pathways of our villages, will feel secure as they go about their daily lives in the university grounds of our universities, will feel that the workplace is a place where they can be advanced and where they can reach out for their dreams. It is at this moment that I ask that we honor those women who have been brutally killed, those women who have also been raped, those women who have been brutally violated through violence, young and old, but particularly those women who have died recently, either through deep depression or who have been killed. And it is at this moment that I ask that we all stand and observe a moment of silence in honor of those women who were so brutally violated. And as we dip our heads, that we should all vow that this scourge of violence that is being perpetrated against the women of our country must come to an end. And as a government, we commit ourselves, and as we lead to the National Gender Summit, we will want to do good by the women of our country. But for now, as men, we hang our heads in shame because we have not done good by the women of our country. But at this moment, let us observe this moment of silence and let the sadness and the hurt that is felt by the women of our country seep into our consciousness, seep into our hearts and our minds, and that we should vow as South Africans that we will stop this scourge of the killing of women, the rape of women, and the violence that is perpetrated against the women of our country. Let us bow our heads and observe a moment of silence. Thank you. With this, we dedicate ourselves as South Africans that we're going to do everything in our power to empower the women of our country. Thank you.